Okay, can you hear me okay? Great. Well, good morning. And thank you to President Sullivan and also Doug Longtime here at UVM for providing me, my Green Mountain College colleagues, and my students with opportunities for collaborative engaged learning. It really is an unusual scenario here in Vermont. And I also would like to thank Doug and President Sullivan for advancing my knowledge in networking as a farmer through UVM Extension, the Center for Sustainable Agriculture, the UVM Food Summit, and many other opportunities. It really is rare for faculty members from other colleges to be able to have the opportunity to work with a land-grant institution in the way that we do here in Vermont, and certainly to have a consortium of food systems, colleges, and universities across the state working together, which really helps move all of us forward, and it helps to create a more collaborative environment rather than just a competitive environment. And it's also an honor to be here with you because my family's roots are very deep in extension. My grandfather was at North Carolina State as a plant pathologist for about 40 years, established the Sand Hills Experimental Research Station there, and he was working on peach tree, the breeding of peach trees, and also grape varieties. And as a result of that, the idea for him was that he wasn't just doing agricultural work, it wasn't just natural resource management, but for him it was an opportunity to try to create economic development opportunities for those farmers who were out there. People like him who grew up in South Carolina and didn't have shoes until he was 6 because the boll weevil, I won't tell you exactly what he called the boll weevil, but really what they were doing in terms of developing these peach tree varieties was trying to build out some new economic opportunities for people. And in the spirit of things here today, with all of the acronyms flying around, I thought that I would honor that, and I'm happy if you'd like, instead of calling me Philip Ackerman-Leist, you can call me Philip Acronym-Leist for the rest of the day. And I'm waiting here sort of for some version during the rest of the day, perhaps for there sort of to be the YMCA kind of thing here on the front stage, but I think it might breed some sort of kinesthetic dyslexia on my part, so I'm probably not going to do that. But even though this conference looks a little bit like an alphabet soup that stayed on the stove too long, and the letters all started to stick together into a goopy mess, I do understand why it is that you're here together. And, looking like a loving spoonful of glutinous letters, I applaud your intent. In fact, I think what you're doing here today by bringing these two organizations together is something that's absolutely fantastic. And the reason for that is natural resource conservation doesn't happen without community development. And community development is short-lived if there's no focus on natural resources. Cultivating community and cultivating the commons, that is the public trust, our shared and inherited resources, go hand in hand. In fact, I think that's part of the reason that local food movements and the good food movement, as Will Allen calls it, are so strong. I would argue that it's because of the tight and obvious and appreciated linkage between community development and natural resources that we have in our food systems work. But can we really unite natural resources and community development and build a path to resiliency, as you've claimed that you're doing here today by way of the conference brochure? And the best answer to that, in my mind, comes not by way of data and diatribe, but through stories. Stories that turn our heads, twist our assumptions, and give us hope. For your organizations, you might say, pun intended, stories are the best extension of your successes. And you'll get the attention of a farmer, a forester, a fisher, or a farmer's market customer a lot faster through a story than you will through a peer-reviewed article. Not that those aren't important, but they're just not always effective ways of beginning the dialogue. So what I'd like to do here for a little bit is share some stories, perhaps of things that never should have happened with regard to combining natural resources, the concern for those, and then also for community development. But in fact, they did happen. So earlier this week, I decided I would visit a friend of mine, Greg Cox, at Boardman Hill Farm in Rutland. We met at 5 o'clock, and I wanted to hear a bit more of Greg's story of what's been happening the last couple of years. We've been working together now since 2000. And so I met with Greg at 5, and as it turns out, I left his house at 1 in the morning, and there wasn't a lot of drinking involved. It was simply a time to get together and talk about the work that he's been doing, which I find incredibly inspirational, and I think really speaks to what it is that you're here talking about today. Greg's farm is an amazing place. It's a farm that has been conserved through the Vermont Land Trust. He's incubated now about 10 different farmers who are active farmers who are out there. He's given them land, he's provided them with a commercial kitchen, he's given them startup funds when they need it. He's absolutely an incredible person. But Greg's vision goes much, much further, far beyond his farm. And part of what you can see here is one aspect of that. This is a community solar project that he has here, in which he has different investors who work together to put together this large solar facility here on his farm. And he's always thinking outside of the box. He's always moving ahead. He is certified organic, and Greg is someone who has always said, I'm not farming for myself, I'm farming for my community. And I think you'll understand more of that here in just a minute. So Greg had this vision years ago. In 2002, Rutland, Vermont is a place that's very interesting. It's a place that when you look at the socioeconomic demographics, it was about in 2000, 2002, it really had probably the most challenging socioeconomic demographics here in the state. It's a place where you wouldn't necessarily expect success. And yet it's a place in which success came forward in some very interesting ways. So in 2002, we started working together. We put together a map of all of the different resources that we could find in terms of farms that were out there that could potentially do more direct marketing or were already involved in direct marketing. So we put together the map. Again, a work-study student is always a good way to get things done. When you need to combine databases and do some of the grunt work, that worked out quite well. And we created a nonprofit organization soon thereafter called RAFFLE, the Rutland Area Farm and Food Link. And Greg and I served on that board together. We got it started. And over the years, what started to happen that was very interesting, which I think there's wisdom and also an interesting piece of this story. RAFFLE had this question before it, as many of us do. Was it going to be a service organization, or was it going to go down the path of bricks and mortar? And over time, there was a certain impatience that came about. Greg was president, I believe. He worked with us for 9 years on RAFFLE. Finally, he decided that he wanted to do the bricks and mortar piece. RAFFLE was focused primarily at that point on being more of a service organization. And Greg, as a farmer, an impatient farmer, really wanted to see things happen in terms of the possibility of doing something that he may or may not call a food hub. You can decide for yourself here at the end of the day. But this is what happened. So this is the Vermont Farmers Food Center. This is an idea that was born really by Greg, something he talked about for years and years. The interesting thing about this sign, the picture's not beautiful, but if you could see down below it, it's on a foot of concrete. Because where this is, just across the railroad tracks from the Vermont Farmers Food Center, is actually a brownfield site. And so you can't disturb the soil. So they had to pour this concrete pad, 12 inches of concrete, just to put the sign there. So Greg did, in a very kind of Rutland-esque fashion, he did what Rutland folks tend to know how to do, decided that he was going to help the community pull itself up by its bootstraps. Again, in a place that was economically and socially challenged with lots of different health issues. So what happened over time that I think is absolutely extraordinary? Greg had this vision. He got several people together. All they had was $10,000. They were looking for a place. They found an old warehouse, a building supply warehouse, which they transformed into the Vermont Farmers Food Center. They only had $10,000 to put down on a site that was about $450,000. They talked to the owners who owned this as a building supply operation. They talked to them and said, not only do we only have $10,000 to put down for all of the expenses, we also can't incur any taxes, any interest, or any penalties until we open at this particular facility. So why did they need this particular facility? They needed it because Greg also had the vision to have one of the first winter farmers markets in all of Vermont, in Rutland. They started that in 2007. They ran it for 2 years in an unheated space in Rutland. It was there starting in 2007, and so what was really extraordinary about this is, of all the places in Vermont, Burlington included, it was Rutland. One of the places that really had been beat down economically more than just about anywhere else in the state. It was there that we ran a farmer's market for the first time, starting in 2007, that went 52 weeks out of the year. If you can do it in Rutland, you can do it anywhere. But you can't do it without people like Greg and without folks who supported him. And so finally, obviously, the unheated space got to be a bit old. So Greg and other folks started looking around, trying to find the space, which they eventually did here. So they opened the Vermont the Food Center here in 2012. And this is the outside now with community gardens. Each one of these particular plots is a different organization, a different nonprofit organization. You can see that these raised beds are wheelchair accessible. Where you can't see very well in the corner, there's a group of folks who are playing bocce over on the other end. All of these bricks are hand laid by Greg's son and one other person. And there was an extraordinary community effort that came into being once this vision was laid before people here in Vermont. And so when you look inside, and you can check out the video if you'd like to see the story of this, when you look inside now, it's absolutely extraordinary. There are 86 spaces for food-related businesses. On average, there are 70 businesses that are there each Saturday during the winter. What this has done in many ways is it's provided farmers with the opportunity to make more cash, in some cases to diversify what they're doing, in other cases really to magnify what they're doing. And it also means they don't have to win back the customers every single spring. So it really has been pretty extraordinary in what they've done. And not only have they done a Saturday farmers market where their average is 1,000 customers during a 4-hour period on Saturdays. Their peak is 2,000 customers. These are the times they've gone in and they've counted. They've also started a Wednesday evening farmers market during the winter that runs from 3 to 6 p.m. That one, as Greg says, is still a bit more challenged. They're still working their way through there. So in 2011, which was the last year at their previous site, their vendor gross was $750,000. In 2012, the first year at the Food Center, at that point they had $1 million, and in 2015 their vendor gross from the Winter Farmers Market exceeded $2 million. It's absolutely amazing what these folks have done. And so you can see the activity here, it fills up constantly. They're using it also and building it more as they continue to build it out and raise money, using it more and more as a year-round facility for different events. And Greg's visions, along with his boards, just simply don't stop. You can see that these are some of the buildings. You can get a sense of some of the work now that they still have to do on the renovations of the other buildings. One of the things that they've noted as they've looked up and down the East Coast at various food hubs, there's never enough storage in any of those facilities, according to Greg and his board. And so they're actually planning on utilizing 3 stories of this building that you see here on the left, and utilizing all 3 for storage and economic developments of other types. And as you look across here, it just gives you a little bit of a sense. It doesn't look like much necessarily in some ways, but what happened here I think is a testament to how entrepreneurial they've been, and they really have combined a concern for natural resources with also this economic development opportunity. So when they needed to put a new roof on this structure out here, they decided that not only would they put on a new roof, but they would also put on solar panels. So they got a grant for $27,000, or I'm sorry, for $20,000 to put the solar panels on. That paid part of the cost of roofing, and they had to come up with another $27,000 in order to put the roof on. But they were able to combine those efforts and provide a good portion of the power there for the facility. And what you can barely see in the little corner of the roof here, and Greg didn't have the key that evening, or I'm sure we would have spent a couple of hours inside there, is an Austrian biomass facility. And it burns 3 different things. It burns chips, pellets, and pucks. And the idea there is that the puck piece is particularly interesting, not because the farmers are hockey players, but because if they do these dried pucks, whenever there's storm damage there in the town, they can actually get the residue, chip it up, and create these pucks by drying it in a special machine that they're looking for. If a farmer or someone else is mowing the edge of a field and doing their bush hogging around the edge, they can also gather that residue and turn those into pucks. So they're trying to actually heat this winter space, by virtue of things that are coming from within the city limits and also from farmers' fields, things that otherwise would be considered waste residues. So it really is a pretty amazing place. And this may seem like an odd picture, but this was getting to be dark as Greg and I were sitting there. And he's sitting in a 1939 rail car seat. And so this is right above the farmer's market. This is the place where there'll be a cafe. People can sit and watch and look out over the, the busyness during the Saturday markets and the Wednesday evening markets. And it's symbolic. And there's also, bizarrely enough, there's a rail car that's sitting right outside the Vermont Food Venture, or the Vermont Farmers Food Center. And Greg said between these seats that you see here that he got for free and the rail car outside, he wants a very public reminder that Rutland was the heart of distribution from Vermont with its agricultural products into the cities. And that at one point in time, it was really the hub. And so he has an idea. It's going to be interesting to see where it goes. He's been talking to federal officials now. He wants the Heart of Vermont rail car, where they load up from the Vermont Farmers Food Center. They actually load up a rail car. They're right there on the rail lines, load it up with Vermont goods, and take it into the city. What they're bumping up against, obviously, are the distribution channels once they get in, but they've got some incredibly creative ideas for how they may actually make that work. So watch for that rail car, or even, knowing Greg, that series of rail cars. He may take the whole darn train before it's all over, and see what actually happens there. They've also built a commercial kitchen on the inside, and as Greg described it, he said, anything we do, he said, it's all about teepee poles. They all have to rest against one another. Everything has to work together and hold itself up. He said one of the things that happens when you're working with low-income folks who are actually, you're trying to do some of the cooking skills, he said it's divorced from the farmer's market very often. It also means that they have one more place they have to go. Oftentimes they don't even have transportation. It's one more thing they have to do, one more thing they have to fit within a busy week's schedule. And so what he wants to do, and what is happening here with this commercial kitchen they're building out, which is right there beside the farmer's market, it's right on the inside, is they're doing cooking demonstrations. It means that also people who are coming in, perhaps who are lower income or health challenged, as they provide their health shares for them, they don't have to be segregated from everyone else. There's a guest chef every single week that's offering these cooking demonstrations, cooking lessons, things to do with the farmer's market that's there. And it's also there so that they can do catering events throughout the course of the year. So it's a highly integrated part of this whole operation, and I think really wise. It's wise in what they the approach that they've had there. So I think Greg's story, and I'll share a couple of others here that I think are really interesting. What's happened here with the Vermont Farmers Food Center is that community has come together, has pulled itself up by the bootstraps. It's demonstrated that people can come together and contribute everything from windows to furniture, to their time, to pull all of this together. And it's an exciting place to watch, and I think just one example of many that are happening around the country. And so I quickly wanted to share a couple of other places. As I had this book, Rebuilding the Food Shed, that came out a couple of years ago, I always say that the book tour should really always come before you write the book, because that's where you learn the most. But here are a couple of samples of places and people and opportunities that I've seen that have been really interesting as we've gone along. I'm just curious, how many folks here have heard of Athens, Ohio? Good. So we've got a good showing there. And you may have heard this description of Athens, Ohio, which I think is just an incredible place that one of my graduate students, who was actually at my house yesterday, who is from Athens, Ohio, she's the one who opened my eyes to Athens. And I hope if you haven't checked it out, or you haven't had the chance to really understand how they operate, you have the opportunity to go there. Because some, and I think it's an untapped secret out there, some have called Athens, Ohio, the most mature local food system in the United States. And part of what's particularly fascinating that my grad student has been working on for a number of years is, how in the heck did it happen? It shouldn't necessarily have happened right there, right at the foothills of the Appalachians, again, an area that is fairly beleaguered economically. How is it that it sprung up there? And what's interesting too is it really is sort of this meeting. It's this meeting of folks from different places. The Amish are there, conventional farmers are there, the back to the landers are there, and people have created a collective vision and pushed that forward. And a lot of that really has to do with several folks there. June Holly and then also Leslie Schaller, among others, have done a phenomenal job creating AceNet, as you see here, which has been an amazing business incubator, and they've just been incredible. If you ever get the chance to hear either of them speak, I hope that you'll do that. And part of what Athens has done, and this for me, and again, this was post book and something that woke me up. Part of the reason I realized that I bought into the idea that Athens was one of the most mature local food systems in the country is because they'd embraced grains and also legumes. And that's a piece that folks like me, we were thinking fruits and vegetables, meats, dairy, and we weren't thinking about the grains and the legumes. And well, duh, I mean, this is actually the heart and soul of our food system, really are these grains and legumes, and that's something someone like myself certainly should have thought about. And one of the most interesting things in visiting Athens that I discovered was Casa Nueva, which is a local restaurant with a Mexican flair. And when you go in, it's worker-owned, which is interesting in and of itself. So this notion of cooperatives and also collaboration is very strong there. And so when you go in, the beans that you get, obviously, are coming from the area, and also the grains, the tortilla chips, the corn is coming from the area. It's really pretty extraordinary. But one of the things that also is interesting and disturbing that Lisa was telling me about at dinner the other night was that now fracking is moving in, and they really are worried with the injection wells that they could lose everything that they built over time. So it's a really intense and scary proposition for many of them. So it's these places that are often at the edges that I think are particularly interesting to look at. And here another place is in Tallahassee. And just extraordinary what's happened in Tallahassee. And I'm sure there's some folks from Florida and people who know much, much more about it than I do. But I was just really taken aback by what had been going on with the Tallahassee Food Network, and particularly with the African American community, and what they've done historically for decades and decades, really in transforming many of the lessons and the strategies of the civil rights movement and era, and using those to tackle their food system and food systems education by doing everything from having these community gardens, putting them right in the heart of the city, to also having their collards and cornbread monthly meetings, in which last year in 2015, they brought together over 200 different individuals from 60 organizations every month to come together to talk about the food system and what needed to happen, and also to bridge both the racial and the socioeconomic lines. And Tallahassee is an amazing place in terms of food. I was just totally blown away by what's happening with regard to the food systems there. And then again, kind of beleaguered environments, if you will. I'm sorry to cast it that way perhaps, but in Arizona, and here there's a photo with Gary Nabhan, who wrote a great book, which certainly seems timely this week, Growing Food in a Hotter, Drier Land. So, these efforts to try to get farmers to figure out ways in which, as the one in the upper left-hand corner there, ways in which they can build organic matter levels so that they can actually really thrive. This is actually a working CSA. They've got 40 families that they feed there, and the farmer's been particularly innovative in ways in which he's been managing the organic matter. And the cattle down below were discarded in many ways, or at least they were sort of set off to the side. Criollo is the way I would pronounce it, but it's the heritage breed of cattle there that can actually survive in this environment. And as not only have things gotten hotter, but there's more emphasis also on grass-fed, these particular cattle are coming back, and some of the ranchers are trying to advance those forward and see what they can do to rebuild their own food system. And Ocracoke, North Carolina is another amazing example, and what you see, the white aluminum building down in the corner there may not look like much, but that's the heart and the soul of the folks who really are the small-scale traditional fishermen in that particular area. That's the fish house, the ice house. That's the place, as you can see right up above, that has the basic processing infrastructure for people there on Ocracoke. And what is really interesting, I'm talking to Captain Hardy Plyler, who pulled together the fisher folk there to actually try to, when this went on the auction block, they actually found a way, again, by raising money, to actually grab hold of it and turn it into essentially a cooperative. So that the issue was that if they didn't have this ice house, this fish house, what was going to happen was that it meant that the folks would go out and start their fishing, as Captain Hardy Plyler and others did, very early in the morning, and then they would have to go almost 3 hours to the mainland with their catch. They may not have the ice for the catch actually to be conserved as it needed to be, and then 3 hours back. So it was going to add somewhere between 5 and 6 hours a day, and also the added expense that they had if that particular ice house or fish house didn't remain intact. And so not only that, but they also built this marketing campaign called Ocracoke Fresh, called today the traditional way, and again, really working against some very powerful market forces, but trying to make things work for their community with community economic development and also natural resource conservation. This is kind of my home turf here, Green Mountain College, and this is when I just wanted to point out you can turn, and we did, we took the word food shed and turned it into the local woodshed. And so this was a student proposal, wasn't something that came from the administration. They were tired of seeing us burning crude number 6, which is what is the dirtiest fuel that's out there. Environmental college, that's our focus. That's not a good thing. So students developed this idea that we needed to have a local woodshed. And so they helped us move along. They actually, the students did the fundraising, helped us hire the consultant who showed us how to do a biomass facility. And the idea that the students had was that they wanted everything, all the wood for the biomass facility to come from within 20-mile radius, if at all possible. And so you can see that here, but the college has also diversified its energy portfolio. We buy 50% of cow power for our main campus for our electricity, which is using methane digesters, which are just north of us. And then we buy 100% of cow power for all our ancillary buildings out around. We've also put in a new solar array that does about 10% of the power on campus, and have another community solar project further from campus. So trying to get to a 100% renewable energy portfolio there. So I want to start to kind of wrap up here to a certain degree. This is an important point, I think, as we're thinking about natural resources and also community economic development. A new book is out by Philip Howard. I really encourage you to check it out if you get a chance. It's called Concentration and Power in the Food System. And one of the things that Phil does so beautifully is he puts these things into context. And sometimes, for myself, I also have become a little bit fatigued at various times of the subsidy conversation. But this one is really interesting because it starts to show sort of the paradigm within which we're working now, with regard to subsidies. And just where the points of power are. Because that's important as we're talking about natural resources and we're also talking about community economic development. But another graphic, and you'll, I hope, see why this is so important to me here in just a minute. It's this notion of concentrated power in terms of our not only our food system, but really it's the same for forestry, for fisheries, natural resources. Almost everything is moving more and more, it seems, toward higher levels of concentration. And my view is that it becomes harder and harder for us to do the work that many of us are trying to do as this moves more and more to a concentrated system. And I think that's something that that's really worth bringing out. And so really, why is it that I bring that out? It's because I think the consolidation and concentration have made our work in natural resource management and community development much more difficult. And it's not just that we spent 2 to 3 generations watching the deconstruction of local food sheds, woodsheds, and watersheds, but we've also witnessed the dissolution of the public trust, of individual opportunity, biological and economic diversity, community visions of the future, equity and equality, even of democracy. So the result is that now much of our work happens on the edges, sometimes working our way into the center of this concentration, and sometimes even toppling it, albeit very gradually. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We don't have to apologize for working in and on the edges of the dominant realities. It is in and around those edges that transitions happen. Remember that edges play a critical role in ecology. The edge effect is what happens as two habitats overlap. These edges are appreciated by ecologists, and often the natural and also the wild inhabitants of the area also appreciate it, because these are the places of increased diversity. They're places of intersection, ambiguity, and transition. They may not be at the center, at the points of dominant activity, but they may be the places most receptive to change. We can think of these edges not just as ecological realities, but also economic and political realities. That is, places ripe for community development initiatives, places filled with lessons of transition. It is the edges, not the dominant center of the status quo, that holds the clues to resilience. The initiatives that we develop at the edges may one day be any given community's best defense against unforeseen environmental, social, or economic change. Ultimately, what we are looking for is a reciprocity between stewardship and innovation. Stewardship and innovation. It's a Buddhist-like experience of somehow holding on while also letting go. So I want to share why I think this piece is so important as I wrap up here. It's a project that I'm working on now. This is in the Italian Alps. It's a German-speaking area, autonomous province of the South Tyrol. It's a place where I lived, worked, taught, farmed ever since 1983 and still go back quite a bit. And what's interesting about this area, climate change obviously is moving in the Alps, having a significant impact. This town of Maltz is the highest town at the end of a valley called the Finchgau Valley. It's a place where all of a sudden apples, which are one of the mainstays there in the South Tyrol, the apple growers are able to move up, up, up in terms of elevation. And it's also an area where some of you have seen or heard of the Iceman, who was found underneath a glacier, 5,300 years old. This is where the Iceman was found, up in the mountains right above the Finchgau Valley. So 5,300 years of food traditions. Some of the same grains are still grown and utilized in this area that were found on the Iceman. It was a dairy culture even back then. And what's happened in Maltz is the apple growers have started to move in. And as they moved in, it's created a very unusual kind of problem for them. And that is a pesticide drift. This is Gunther Wallnerfe. And Gunther really was the canary in the coal mine for what happened in Maltz that has been precedent-setting in almost every way. And what happens is there was a 3-meter buffer that was required. There were apple orchards that moved in on 2 sides of him. He's an organic dairy farmer. There's a 3-meter buffer required for pesticides there. The pesticides drifted over. It's a longer story. Actually, if you like, the issue of organic life that just came out and hit the shelves this week has a 10-page story. The photos that you see here are done by Douglas Gateman, the lexicon of sustainability. And so we summarize the story there in Organic Life if you'd like to read more. But what happened was that all of a sudden Gunther's entire existence was in jeopardy. Not only was his in jeopardy as the apple growers were moving in, the grains of the area, that they were just getting the resurgence, the local grains were just starting to come back in. They were also having issues. The conventional livestock farmers also were having issues with the pesticide drift. The parcel sizes are very small here. So what happened in Maltz was really rather astounding and precedent-setting, and that's why Douglas and I are working on 4 short films and a microsite and a book that'll be out this time next year. And we're trying to tell the story because what happened here was a community, again, of people that they had no background in political organizing. But what they did was they had a manifesto first in which they had all of the scientists and health professionals sign it, that they were worried about the influence of the pesticides that were moving into their area. They were worried about the traditional foods that they had being taken over. And so they had the manifesto which came forward, which led to a referendum, which they held for 2 weeks so everyone could participate. And it was for a pesticide-free future. And 75% of the town actually voted in favor of this pesticide-free future and then developed the ordinances to be what they hope to be the first pesticide-free town in the world. It's not without struggle. In fact, there are quite a few struggles that they're facing here, but really an extraordinary story. And one more example really of kind of this David and Goliath scenario which many of us face. So when we think about the story of Maltz and all of these other communities, what really is the biggest challenge in this path toward resilience? I would say that it's both staying power and the power of staying. We live in a highly mobile society in which natural resource conservation and community development have too often been shoved into the back seat and taken for a ride. As we try to respond, we are encumbered by grants of 1 to 3 years, funders' pet words that sometimes last 3 to 5 years, and a media that wants all the time a new story. Meanwhile, the irony is we're trying to create community development natural resource conservation projects that we hope will last 1, 2, 3, or more generations. It all takes a lot of staying power to do this kind of work. And even more importantly, perhaps, it requires that we pass on to the next generation the power of staying. But we have to give them a reason to stay. Vibrant communities and a healthy environment. One without the other may not be enough. Thank you.